Hey class, hope everyone is doing well. I wanted to make a quick video that overlaps with some of the things that we've been talking about in this module, but mainly focuses on Southern Gothic literature. So let me just start by saying that hopefully at this point you have already reviewed the module notes and that you have gathered that this particular module is going to be focusing on literature post-World War I. The first part of that the class notes have talked about was the modernism movement and post-World War I, how many of the authors addressed the questions that they had when it came to the changing society through their literature. And as I mentioned in those notes, that it wasn't necessarily just about asking questions about the changing society, but it also had to do with asking questions about themselves and challenging previous viewpoints, and then also experimenting with writing styles in general. So what I've done for this module is I've divided it into 4 separate literary movements as opposed to the themes like I did in the Gilded Age. For this, we've had the unit on poetry, and then we have one on the Southern Gothic literary movement, one on Harlem Renaissance, and then one on the Lost Generation. So for this week, we're focusing on Southern Gothic literature. So the Southern Gothic literary movement, it was a unique one, and it is one that we still consider to be ongoing. So first, when we talk about Gothic in general, I know that instinctively we start to think about old Victorian England, or we think about things like Dracula, Frankenstein. Those are all parts of the original Gothic movement. And if you did American Lit 1, you might have talked about the Gothic movement. The characteristic of that particular Gothic movement, of course, it was dated prior to this, but like the current Southern Gothic literary movement, it too focused on things like the supernatural. It focused on things that were considered to be more grotesque, darkness. So that was all part of the original Gothic. Oh, another one you might have heard of, Edgar Allan Poe, falls into this original Gothic category. Now, Southern Gothic, it's a little bit different, although it's inspired by that. So Southern Gothic takes its roots in the original Gothic movement. So like the original Gothic movement, it too tends to focus on what would be considered to be more grotesque. For instance, things like the darker themes, monsters, supernatural, but also people that are more dark, not just criminal, but perhaps look more grotesque, have characteristics that we normally would think, gosh, that person I don't want to be around. The characters have this darkness to them. So it follows that trend, but what's different about Southern Gothic literature is it does have qualities that make it uniquely Southern, to put it pretty simply. Southern Gothic literature, as you would expect, its stories take place in the South, and they're created by Southern writers. So they look at the South and they question the Southern qualities of life, what makes a person a Southerner, life in small town South, but it also builds on those themes that we talked about in modernism of a changing society, and it's willing to confront some of the problems when it comes to the South. Now, when I mention that, I'm not being hard on the South, we're all in the South, but as we talked about in the Gilded Age, post-Civil War South was a challenging time. It was challenging not just because of the reasons that we all know when it came to the freed slaves and the racism and oppression that followed that, but also there was a loss of property. There was destruction in towns. There was destructions when it came to plantations. People who were once very wealthy now were struggling to keep that same wealth in their life because, as sad as it is for us to think of this, their slaves were their property, and that's how they were able to be successful plantation owners. So all that I know we're familiar with, but what the Southern writers did is once the Reconstruction started, and once people in the South had to start questioning, okay, well, what is this new South going to look like? We know what the old South looked like. We had the plantations and we had the slaves and we had our principles when it came to this, but now we're almost starting over. and what was our role when it came to the Civil War, and what's our guilt in the Civil War. So there was a lot of questions moving forward during Reconstruction, and that's where Southern Gothic literature started, is that the Southern writers in the past, they tended to shy away from these types of topics. It was just a small group that really looked at them. But Southern Gothic, they were willing to look at these problems in the South, and they were willing to ask what their role was, and they were willing to put guilt on the South, and they were willing to even question what exactly it meant to be Southern prior to the Civil War and post-Civil War. In addition to that, Southern Gothic has some unique qualities. And if you've read anything so far, whether you picked up Faulkner or whether you looked at Flannery O'Connor, you probably picked up on some of these qualities. First of all, Southern Gothic literature, it takes place in the South, of course, but it tends to take place in small towns. And oftentimes these small towns sound very dilapidated, dated, fallen apart. So they paint this picture of almost like a hovering darkness over the South. The descriptions, I know they're very wordy at times, but they too paint this picture of just dust-covered buildings, falling apart plantations, buildings that are empty. So what once was a vibrant community is now being shown as a failing one. Also within the writing style, some of this I mentioned, but that idea of the grotesque. So it's going to be things like death and darkness. And they definitely love the outsider. You probably have picked that up a little bit, especially Flannery O'Connor. She loves the idea of an outsider coming in and almost observing what this world is like. And then the people who already live there questioning, who is this outsider? Why is he or she here? William Faulkner does it as well. But Flannery O'Connor, which we're going to expand on her more because she does start in Southern Gothic, but she continues on past 1945. So we'll come across her again. But she also looks at many questions of faith and religion when it comes to her characters. William Faulkner, not as much. He tends to focus just on their southernness. There's a lot of irony in Southern Gothic. Now, in day-to-day life, when we say irony, it's not the term that we always hear in conversation. Irony, in the actual term, irony is when you see something that you wouldn't expect. Like, for instance, if a person in front of you has all vegan attire, as far as like, I'm a vegan t-shirt, and he's like going on against meat, and then he sits down and eats a hamburger. Well, that's ironic because it's not what you expect somebody that's declaring to be a vegan to do. In literature, irony is when something unexpected happens to our characters, or even we look at it sometimes as you would expect that opposite to occur based on what we've been given, but then something not just completely unexpected, but almost cruel happens to the characters. And we see that a lot in William Faulkner especially. We spend the whole story reading thinking one thing is going to happen, and then when we finish it, it's a completely different ending than we had expected. And there's all different types of irony in literature, but irony in that sense, we see a lot of when it comes to Southern Gothic. Let's see. Some of the other characteristics to look for in the writing style is there's a lot of stream of conscious thoughts. The characters are going through self-exploration, so that's how the writers write. And at times it can be challenging to read when a continual descriptive stream of consciousness. It sounds like I'm picking on William Faulkner a lot because I've never particularly loved Faulkner, although I respect those who do. And that's part of Faulkner's writing style is he's very descriptive, and he spends a lot of time developing characters through novels where they are really just debating their life and viewing what they see around them. So that's some of the characteristics of Southern Gothic. And I just picked two writers that are the most common Southern Gothic. William Faulkner, if you Google him at all, that's what's going to come up, that he is the father of Southern Gothic, because he really is. He's the one that's really not just started this movement, but wrote in this and was unique to the Southern Gothic movement in that he is from Mississippi, or was from Mississippi, and he created this fictional town where, based on where he grew up, where all of his stories take place. So we read A Rose for Emily, and you're going to get introduced to this town and the characters of this town and the description of this town. And true to his form, it is unexpected irony, and it is also grotesque, and he's willing to take up this idea of supernatural and the idea of death in this small town. Flannery O'Connor, also Southern Gothic, but her style is different. Although she also does include stream of consciousness at times, she also does include small towns. You will find, as you read her more, especially post 1945, that her stories move beyond just the question of South, but more the question of, like I mentioned, the question of religion, the question of faith, which tends to be more universal themes than what you might see in Southern Gothic as a whole. So hopefully this helps some. I know that I will, when we get into the next one, we're entering two of my favorite literary movements, so it's hard for me to keep them both just at 1 week. I would do a month on each if I easily could. So I hope that you enjoy Southern Gothic, but when we get to the Lost Generation and Harlem Renaissance, I hope that you really, really like them. Well, if you have any questions, you know to reach out to me at any time.